Welcome back to Restoring British Health, the investigative podcast that pulls apart what's really in our food, our water, and our supply chain. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a deep dive into Britain's waterways and uncovering the facts the industry would rather you didn't know. If you've been paying attention lately to the environmental crisis that's going on in our rivers, you'll know it's a pretty bad idea to be swimming in them. Channel 4 recently ran a documentary, Dirty Business, talking about the scandals within our waterways, and it's had many people talking and a great deal of people angry. Rightly so. This episode is going to delve into all the facts, the numbers behind the outrage, the money behind the pollution, and the system that has allowed it to continue unchallenged for 35 years. Because the truth is far worse than most people realise. In 2024, water companies in England discharged raw, untreated sewage into rivers and coastal waters for 4.7 million hours. 4.7 million hours. That is roughly 450,000 recorded spill events. The equivalent of over 5 centuries of continuous sewage dumping pumped into the waterways that feed our taps, irrigate our food, and sustain what remains of our freshwater ecosystems. All in a single calendar year. To put that in human terms, one sewage discharge event occurs every 30 seconds. While you've been watching this, raw human waste has entered a river somewhere. This is not a failure of infrastructure. It is not an unfortunate consequence of Victorian-era plumbing. It is the predictable outcome of a system designed to extract maximum financial value from a captive public while investing the minimum possible in the pipes beneath their feet. When the water industry in England and Wales was privatised in 1989, the companies were handed to private ownership debt-free. Debt-free. The government wrote off all existing borrowings to give the new owners a fresh start. The promise was straightforward. Private capital would flow in, infrastructure would be modernised, and the British public would benefit from the efficiency of the market. Well, 35 years later, the results are in. The 16 privatised water monopolies have paid out approximately £78 billion in dividends to shareholders since 1991. 78 billion. That payout is nearly half the 190 billion the company spent on infrastructure over the same period. And simultaneously, these debt-free companies have now accumulated more than 64 billion pounds in net debt, borrowing not primarily to invest, but to sustain dividend payments to their owners. I'm going to say that again because you have to understand it. Companies that were given to private investors with zero debt have since borrowed £64 billion, paid out £78 billion in dividends, and are now asking you and me to fund the infrastructure investment they should have made the entire time. Water bills are now expected to rise by an average of 36% by 2030. The companies that fail to invest are passing the cost of their failure directly to the households they serve. And who owns these companies? England's 9 major water and sewage companies are more than 90% owned by overseas investors. Sovereign wealth funds, private equity firms, pension funds scattered across China, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Cayman Islands, Qatar, and the UAE. These are not local businesses with a stake in the communities they serve. They are financial vehicles designed to extract returns from a monopoly that no customer can leave. Thames Water, the company that supplies water to approximately 15 million people across London and the Thames Valley, it has accumulated roughly £14 billion in debt. That's approximately 80% of the value of its regulated assets. During a single decade of ownership by Macquarie, the Australian Infrastructure Fund, more than £2.8 billion was borrowed just to finance the purchase, with debt later shifted onto Thames Water itself through a subsidiary in the Cayman Islands. The company has not paid corporation tax for a decade. This is the entity responsible for the drinking water and sewage management of a quarter of England's population. The sewage crisis is not merely an aesthetic problem of floating debris and foul smells. Raw sewage carries a chemical and biological payload that is transforming British waterways into something more closely resembling an open pharmacy experiment. Let's start with the bacteria. Untreated sewage contains E. coli, coliforms, viruses, and a host of pathogenic organisms that pose direct risks to anyone who enters contaminated water. Surfers Against Sewage received 1,853 illness reports from recreational water users in 2024 alone. 5 people every single day reporting sickness after swimming, paddling, or surfing in British waters. Reported illnesses ranged from gastrointestinal infections to chest infections, and in at least one documented case, a sea swimmer from Bognor Regis required open heart surgery after falling critically ill from exposure to polluted water. The Department of Health and Social Care acknowledged in 2022 that sewage and water is a growing public health problem. Yet, the regulatory response has been to set targets for reducing the worst contamination to acceptable levels by 2050, a quarter of a century from now. But sewage is not merely biological waste. It is a delivery system for every pharmaceutical compound excreted by the human population. A 2024 study by researchers at Imperial College London analysed water samples from rivers across the UK. They found antidepressants, antibiotics, painkillers including tramadol and diclofenac, fungicides, pesticides, and stimulants including caffeine and nicotine, all present in significant proportions of the samples. This isn't surprising. Wastewater treatment plants were never designed to filter out pharmaceutical compounds. When you take a course of antibiotics, antidepressants, or hormonal contraceptives, a significant proportion of the active ingredients are excreted. They're flushed into the sewage system and then through the treatment plants that can't remove them, therefore flowing directly into our rivers. The consequences for aquatic life have been documented for decades. Estrogen from contraceptive pills and hormone replacement therapy is present at biologically significant concentrations in rivers receiving treated sewage effluent. Exposure to these synthetic hormones has caused widespread feminization of male fish in English rivers. Male roach developing female reproductive tissue, producing female hormones, suffering reduced fertility. In some cases, entire localized fish populations have completely collapsed. A site on the River Thames even recorded the highest concentrations of certain pharmaceutical compounds identified in one global study. London is simultaneously one of the most medicated and most pharmaceutically polluted urban environments on Earth. Beyond pharmaceuticals sits a more insidious threat. PFAS, commonly known as forever chemicals, or PFAS, a family of more than 10,000 synthetic compounds used in non-stick coatings, waterproof textiles, food packaging, and firefighting foam. They are called forever chemicals because the carbon-fluorine bond that defines them is one of the strongest in chemistry. They do not break down in the natural environment. They accumulate in soil, water, wildlife, and human tissue across generations. The Royal Society of Chemistry has found that more than a third of water courses tested in England and Wales contain PFAS at levels that the Drinking Water Inspectorate classifies as medium or high risk. The River Thames has recorded the highest PFAS concentrations in the country. A 2025 study by the University of York found PFAS contamination across rivers in England and Scotland, with one Glasgow site recording the second highest concentration of one PFAS compound ever found in surface water globally. Now, Here's the part that should make your blood boil. Water companies are only required to monitor for 48 varieties of PFAS. Though there are thousands of different types, most are never even checked. The individual concentration limit for each monitored PFAS is set at 100 nanograms per litre. That is 10 times the level that the Drinking Water Inspectorate's own guidance classifies as low risk. For comparison, the United States has introduced a limit of 4 nanograms per litre for the two most common PFAS compounds. Britain's threshold is 25 times more lenient than America's for the same chemicals. PFAS exposure has been linked to testicular cancer, thyroid disease, increased cholesterol, liver damage, fertility problems, and developmental harm to unborn children. The World Health Organization has classified PFOA, one of the most studied PFAS compounds, as carcinogenic. Yet the UK government has not legislated any of the Drinking Water Inspectorate's PFAS guidance into statute yet. It remains guidance, not law. The cumulative effect of decades of sewage, agricultural runoff, pharmaceutical contamination, and chemical pollution has produced a damning verdict on the state of British waterways. Over 14% of rivers in England currently meet good ecological status. Not a single English water body achieves good chemical status. 0. The country that once set global environmental standards now has waterways in worse ecological condition than many developing nations. Of nearly 4,000 water samples analysed by the Angling Trust between 2023 and 2024, over a third of those breached the threshold for phosphate pollution. In the Warwickshire Avon catchment, 86% of monitored sites exceeded safe levels. In the Medway catchment, every single site breached the upper limit across every sampling period. These are not obscure industrial watercourses. These are the rivers that run through communities, that children play beside, that anglers fish in, that supply the reservoirs ultimately from which your drinking water is drawn. And while sewage receives the most political attention, at least half of water pollution comes from agriculture. Nutrient runoff from fertilizers and animal waste, pesticide contamination, soil erosion from intensive farming, all of it contributing to the eutrophication that is choking British waterways of oxygen and destroying aquatic habitats. The government and governments thereafter are elected on a pledge to clean up these waterways, yet enforcement of the farming rules for water remains inconsistent. And the loopholes that allow intensive agricultural operations to discharge into watercourses remain largely intact. Britain's water regulation framework is a masterpiece of institutional deflection. Ofwat regulates the economics of the water industry. The Environment Agency monitors environmental compliance. The Drinking Water Inspectorate oversees drinking water quality. Natural Resources, Wales, SCPA in Scotland, and DERA in Northern Ireland each have their own jurisdictions. No single body has the authority, the mandate, or the resources to address the crisis holistically. The Environment Agency, the body theoretically responsible for holding polluters to account, has seen its funding cut so severely that prosecutions have become vanishingly rare. Fines, when they are levied, are derisory relative to the profits that they penalise. Southern Water was fined £90 million for 2021 for deliberately dumping raw sewage into the ocean because it was cheaper than treating it. Across nearly 7,000 illegal discharge events at 17 sites over 5 years. 90 million sounds significant until you note that the industry pays out more than £1 billion annually in dividends. 90 million is not a deterrent, simply the cost of doing business. The 2025 Water Special Measures Act introduced some new enforcement tools, including provisions to block bonus payments to water company executives and to bring criminal charges against those who break the law. But the fundamental structural incentive remains unchanged. Water companies are regional monopolies with captive customers, overseas owners seeking financial returns, and a regulatory framework that has consistently failed to compel adequate investment in infrastructure. The government's own storm overflows discharge reduction plan does not require the elimination of ecological harm from overflows until 2045. Significant health improvements near bathing waters are not expected until 2035. The target for reducing overflows to an average of 10 per year is set for 2050. These are not targets. These are permission slips for another generation of contamination. The state of British waterways is not inevitable. Other nations have demonstrated that clean water is a political choice, not a technical impossibility. Scotland's water supply remains in public ownership. Scottish Water has invested £72 more per household per year, 35% more than the privatised English companies. If England had invested at the same rate, an additional £28 billion would have gone into infrastructure since privatisation. Austria passed legislation in 2019 explicitly forbidding the privatisation of water provision. The Netherlands operates water supply through publicly owned entities. Paris and Stuttgart, having experienced the failures of private water suppliers, both restored their water supply to public operators in 2010. Denmark has made significant strides in restricting PFAS use. France has implemented targeted PFAS restrictions. The European Union is progressing with the proposed ban covering all 10,000 plus PFAS substances. The UK, having left the EU's regulatory framework, has adopted what scientists describe as a narrow definition of PFAS, covering only a few hundred substances, excluding thousands more. We could do this. We choose not to. Every discussion of the British water crisis treats it as an environmental issue, an infrastructure issue, or a corporate governance issue. It is rarely discussed as what it fundamentally is: a public health emergency in slow motion. The population of Britain drinks water that may contain traces of pharmaceuticals that treatment plants were never designed to remove. It bathes in waterways contaminated with sewage at a rate of 1 discharge every 30 seconds. It is exposed to forever chemicals at concentrations 10 times the level that the country's own drinking water authority considers low risk. Its rivers, the source of its drinking water, contain antidepressants, antibiotics, hormones, pesticides, and heavy metals. We know that synthetic estrogens in river water are sufficient to feminize male fish and collapse localized populations. We know that PFAS accumulates in human tissue across generations and is linked to cancer, thyroid disease, and fertility problems. We know that antibiotic residues in waterways contribute to antimicrobial resistance in general. The slow-motion pandemic that the World Health Organization has called one of the greatest threats to global health. What we do not know, because nobody is studying it at the necessary scale, is the cumulative effect on human health of chronic, low-level exposure to this chemical cocktail. Through drinking water, through food growth with contaminated irrigation water, through recreational contact with polluted rivers and seas. This is not an absence of evidence, it is an absence of investigation. Why were debt-free public utilities handed to private investors who then borrowed £64 billion while paying out £78 billion in dividends? And why is the public now being asked to fund the infrastructure deficit through higher bills? Why does Britain permit individual PFAS concentrations at 25 times the limit set by the United States for the same compounds? Why are wastewater treatment plants not required to filter pharmaceutical compounds when we have known since the 1990s that synthetic hormones in rivers cause reproductive failure in fish? Why does the government's own target for eliminating ecological harm from sewage overflows extend to 2045? And why does anyone consider this acceptable? Why has no political party of any persuasion in any parliament of the last 35 years proposed a comprehensive British Clean Water Act that sets out legally binding purity standards for every river, lake, and coastal water in the country? This series does not simply document failure. It demands specific remedies. So let me tell you what exactly needs to happen. 1. A British Clean Water Act, setting legally binding purity standards for every river, lake, and coastal water in the country, with enforceable deadlines of no more than 10 years. Not 2045, not 2050, 10 years at most. 2. Statutory PFAS limits aligned with international best practice. The DWI's own guidance must be legislated into statute immediately, with a binding timetable to align UK limits with the US standard of 4 nanograms per litre within 5 years. Guidance that the government's own scientists wrote, but its own ministers refused to enforce. That's not regulation, that is theatre. 3. Mandatory pharmaceutical filtration at all major wastewater treatment plants within 10 years. The technology exists and is deployed in Switzerland, Sweden, and parts of Germany. The UK has not required a single treatment plant to install it. 4. A statutory cap on water company dividends tied to infrastructure investment and environmental compliance. No water company should be permitted to pay dividends to shareholders in any year in which it has committed serious pollution incidents or failed to meet its capital investment program. 5. A single empowered water regulator replacing the current fragmented framework. One body, one mandate, funded by the industry, not the Treasury. 6. Mandatory real-time public disclosure of all sewage discharge events and water quality data. Every consumer should be able to see in real time what is being discharged into the river nearest their home. And finally, 7. A publicly funded, independent epidemiological study into the cumulative health effects of chronic low-level exposure to pharmaceutical residues, PFAS, and microplastics in drinking water around Britain. The public has a right to know what is in their water, and we also have a right to know what it is doing to us. This isn't a left or right wing issue. It's not a question of regulation versus deregulation, or public versus private ownership. It is a question of whether a nation that considers itself civilized is willing to tolerate its own population drinking, bathing in, and growing food with water that is contaminated with sewage, pharmaceuticals, and industrial chemicals, because the alternative would cost money that is currently being paid to shareholders in the Cayman Islands. Every river in Britain is a crime scene. The evidence is measured in millions of hours of sewage, billions of pounds extracted, and a population exposed to a chemical burden that nobody in authority has the courage to quantify. The water crisis is not a future risk, it is a present reality, and every day it continues without systemic reform, the bill in health, in ecological destruction, and in public trust grows ever larger. This is the second in a series examining what Britain puts into its food, its water, and its people, and what it's costing us. Next, we're going to take a look at what comes out of your tap and why nobody wants to talk about it. Please do like and subscribe and share as far as you can. The time for change is now. Thank you.